Another question that has come up several times in meetings is the extent to which a private bank can escape unscathed when there is a process of widespread credit expansion. This is a relatively interesting question. For instance, Goodrich, who founded the Liberty Fund, was a banker, and a paradigmatic one at that, because when Roosevelt declared a bank holiday and prohibited banks from opening, Goodrich said, "What the hell?" He opened his bank precisely to return deposits to everyone who went to withdraw them. Goodrich believed that he would be a criminal if he failed to act in this way, and that he could not leave people high and dry in a bank freeze imposed by Roosevelt. The famous Argentine Corralito, with all of the accompanying protests, social unrest and so on, was not an Argentine original. A similar measure had been taken by none other than an American president, with his so-called bank holiday. Well, those in charge of a sole bank may have the illusion that it will emerge unharmed from a process of credit expansion if two circumstances are present. First, if they believe they will be able to lend money at the margin for only the most profitable and secure projects, those which, when the crisis hits, will be least affected, or will not be affected at all, by the economic recession. And second, if they believe that once they begin their credit expansion on these investment projects, all other banks will simultaneously follow the same expansionary policy at a similar pace, and thus the bank will not lose reserves. That is why it is so important to bankers, and they all have the intuition, ask them and they will tell you, that it is important for credit expansion to be orchestrated so that banks all act more or less in unison. If a certain bank expands credit faster than the others, it immediately loses reserves and becomes relatively less solvent. That is what happened to Banesto during the time of Mario Conde and to the Romasa banks, etc. Joaquin Reg Albiol, may he rest in peace, used to say there was no difference between the Romasa banks and any of the solvent banks at the time. The Banco Central, for instance, except some slight differences of degree in the momentum of the credit expansion initiated. In practice, when banks expand credit more or less in unison, it is usually due to the orchestration of central banks. Furthermore, it becomes clear right away when a bank is straying and losing reserves. In any case, what is very unusual is the first circumstance. That is, for a bank to be able to lend at the margin for only sustainable investment projects. This is mainly because bankers lack the necessary knowledge. They are unable to professionally distinguish between a project that will be sustainable in the long term, throughout the cycle, and a project that will not be. This is especially true in an environment in which interest rates are artificially low. Less collateral is required, and it is impossible to avoid joining in the credit expansion without immediately becoming irrelevant and losing market share. Longfield developed this fundamental argument in the 1840s. Even if, during the bubble stage, bankers are aware that they are beginning to lend money for marginally more risky projects, and that they may very possibly run into trouble in the medium and long term, banks cannot refrain from taking part in the process. I cannot tell you his name, but not long ago, the president of a large Spanish bank made the following comment to me. He told me that bankers knew how crazy many of the loans they were granting were, especially in the real estate sector in Spain. But banks were forced, so to speak, to participate in those syndicated loans because otherwise financial analysts, economic agents and brokers would have run them out of business. They would have lost their market share and become irrelevant within a few years. Bankers were compelled to participate in the madness. In Chapter 8 of my book, Money, Bank Credit and Economic Cycles, I illustrate this with a small table, taken, though in inverted form, from The Prisoner's Dilemma. It shows how we are forced to take measures, make decisions and act in the wrong direction, even when we have serious doubts about the correctness of our choices. We would rather be wrong altogether than right on our own and ostracized. In fact, history appears to confirm this. There is the famous example of the investment fund manager who knew what was going to happen, so he sold the entire fund, even though the expansion continued for a few months afterward. And what was the response? Well, as my grandfather used to say, people want to be deceived. The fund holders rejected this manager who was right, and they fired him, because he was unable to take advantage of the marginal increases in the months which remained. However, he was right, and he is probably still laughing. because later, when everything collapsed, people lost their shirts. Notice how a poorly designed framework encourages us all to blithely march right off a cliff. Therefore, I am very skeptical about a bank's capacity to escape unscathed, even when bankers make every professional effort to achieve it. Granted, there can be differences of degree. A more geographically diversified bank may be able to refrain from participating if the malinvestment is concentrated in a certain area. It is also conceivable for a bank to involve itself to a lesser degree, to invest less in mortgages or the real estate sector, though it sacrifices growth and market share for the sake of solvency, and so on. In any case, it is practically impossible for a bank to keep from getting burned in this bonfire of the vanities.